August 1945. The tropical air clung heavy over the camp in Manila. Heat shimmered off the cracked concrete and faded barracks, the scent of salt and smoke lingering from the city's ruins. Inside, a row of Japanese women officers stood rigid, their black uniforms crisp despite days of scant water. Their eyes, sharp and disciplined, followed every movement of the small group of American nurses entering the open courtyard. The nurses carried nothing but a battered phonograph and a stack of sheet music. Their smiles tentative but warm, a strange contrast to the tense silence that had settled over the former enemies. The first notes of a waltz trickled across the sun-baked ground. Hands hovered, unsure. Shoulders stiffened. Then slowly, curiosity broke the formality. One officer shifted her weight, her gaze tracing the gentle rhythm. Laughter, soft and incredulous, slipped from another. Music, they realized, was a language even war had not erased. And in that moment, rigid authority and weary freedom collided in an unexpected dance. The nurses took the first step forward, and history tilted quietly on its axis. The summer of 1945 marked the final throes of the Pacific War, a conflict that had stretched over 6 brutal years, consuming islands, navies, and cities in flames. By July, the United States had unleashed a relentless series of air raids across Japan, and the capture of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had brought American forces to the doorstep of the Japanese homeland. Soldiers and civilians alike had endured scarcity, destruction, and the relentless discipline of a militarized society. Yet, even amid total war, the human dimension persisted in quiet corners. A shared meal, a whispered word, the faint rhythm of a song drifting through a hospital ward. In the Philippines, liberated in early 1945 after a bloody campaign against entrenched Japanese forces, the American military faced a new responsibility: the administration of former enemy camps, the care of liberated prisoners, and the re-establishment of order. Among the occupiers were American nurses, often young women in their early 20s, trained not only in medicine, but in navigating the fragile psychology of war. They entered POW camps where Japanese officers, some in command of logistics, communications, or even smaller units, still carried the rigidity of militarized authority. These women had been trained to obey, to command, and to endure hardship with a stoic resolve. Now, in defeat, they were confronted with a new environment: surrender, occupation, and the delicate task of coexistence with those they had once considered enemies. The camps themselves were a patchwork of makeshift barracks, open courtyards, and medical stations. Concrete blocks, bamboo walls, and improvised shelters bore the scars of artillery and neglect. Soldiers and officers alike navigated these spaces with caution. The American nurses, though armed only with stethoscopes and medical supplies, carried a subtle form of authority. Their presence was both a relief and a puzzle to the Japanese women officers. Here were representatives of a conquering nation, yet they spoke softly, moved with care, and demanded neither salute nor obedience. Daily routines followed rigid schedules. The Japanese officers maintained roll calls, inspections, and work details. Their minds trained to uphold protocol even as their world crumbled around them. The nurses implemented medical rounds, distributing care to those weakened by malnutrition, disease, and the psychological weight of captivity. Communication between the two groups was often halting. Language barriers, cultural differences, and the residue of wartime animosity complicated even the simplest interactions. Yet, amid these tensions, subtle moments of curiosity emerged. A shared smile, a reluctant nod, or the accidental meeting of eyes across a dusty courtyard hinted at a fragile bridge between conqueror and conquered. Music, an element long constrained in military life, found its way into these camps. Soldiers and prisoners had once sung for morale, for ritual, for the echo of home. For the nurses, music was both a tool and a balm, a way to soothe, to engage, to reach across the divide of language and uniform. Instruments were rare, often improvised from scraps of wood or salvaged phonographs. The nurses carried records of waltzes, jazz tunes, and simple folk melodies, each note a deliberate choice in an effort to bring rhythm and life back into spaces long dominated by order and fear. As August approached, the atmosphere in the camps shifted subtly. Japan's surrender, announced after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had reached the ears of both prisoners and officers alike. Relief, disbelief, and unease coexisted. The Japanese officers, trained to expect death before dishonor, now faced a new reality: survival under the occupation of a nation they had been taught to fear. The nurses, tasked with care and rehabilitation, approached these women not as enemies, but as human beings, balancing caution with empathy. This delicate environment set the stage for one of the war's quieter yet profoundly revealing encounters. A moment when military formality met the universal language of dance, and both sides glimpsed the fragile humanity beyond uniforms and ideology. Even within this environment, small gestures carried immense weight. The appearance of a phonograph in a sunlit courtyard, the unwrapping of sheet music from its protective sleeve, or the gentle coaching of a hand to find rhythm, became acts of diplomacy, therapy, and cultural exchange simultaneously. The Japanese officers, whose daily lives had been dictated by hierarchy, discipline, and the strict codes of Bushido, now found themselves confronted with an unexpected choice: to participate in something frivolous, vulnerable, and utterly foreign, or to retreat behind the walls of duty and pride. It was an unprecedented test of adaptability, curiosity, and emotional courage. The stage was set not in a battlefield or a war room, but in the quiet intersections of humanity. Between nurses and officers, music and silence, surrender and tentative freedom. In these courtyards, history would not be decided by artillery or strategy, but by the subtler, more profound movements of the human heart. One dance, one note, one step could bridge the chasm forged by years of war, even if only for a moment. This fragile balance between authority, curiosity, and human connection formed the backdrop for an event that, though small in scale, revealed the psychological and cultural complexities of the final months of the Pacific War. It was here, in these sun-drenched courtyards and makeshift barracks, that the unexpected convergence of enemies would unfold, teaching lessons not found in manuals or after-action reports. And it was this convergence that would lead, inevitably, to a moment that stunned both sides, when rigid discipline met the liberating rhythm of dance. By late August 1945, the camps were in a state of cautious transition. Japanese officers, once enforcers of strict discipline, now contended with a reality that defied everything they had been taught. Their daily routines, previously dictated by military hierarchy, were replaced with a fragile structure of survival and negotiation. Food distributions, medical inspections, and labor assignments continued, but the rigid purpose that had sustained them through war now appeared hollow. Across the barracks, conversations were whispered in hushed tones. Rumors of the surrender, debates over honor, and questions of what life would mean under American oversight. The American nurses moved through this environment with deliberate care. Their work extended beyond medicine. They functioned as intermediaries, morale builders, and subtle cultural instructors. They assessed wounds, administered vaccinations, and ensured hygiene, but also observed body language, tension, and signs of fatigue or despair. Their presence demanded a careful balance: authority without intimidation, empathy without indulgence. For many of the Japanese women officers, the nurses embodied a paradox: a conquering power offering compassion, skill, and, unexpectedly, a touch of normalcy in a world turned upside down. Language remained a barrier, though translators helped bridge basic communication. Yet even when words failed, gestures, expressions, and shared routines conveyed meaning. A nurse adjusting a uniform, demonstrating how to carry supplies, or guiding a patient through exercise became lessons in trust. Slowly, walls of suspicion began to crack. Some officers observed with curiosity rather than defiance, watching the Americans move with confidence yet kindness. Others resisted, rigid in posture, unwilling to expose vulnerability. The tension between fear and curiosity created a charged atmosphere, one that would prove essential in the moments to come. Amid these interactions, cultural differences emerged in vivid relief. Japanese officers were trained to expect order, solemnity, and adherence to protocol at all times. Smiling without cause, speaking informally, or moving in a relaxed manner could feel alien, even disorienting. For the nurses, whose own training emphasized initiative, flexibility, and the psychological care of patients, these cultural norms were both a challenge and an opportunity. They began to explore ways to engage beyond medical necessity, introducing small elements of everyday life, simple games, shared stories, and eventually, music. Music itself became a tool of quiet diplomacy. Records of waltzes, foxtrots, and soft jazz were played during meal distributions, in waiting areas, or during light exercises. Officers, accustomed to silence punctuated by commands, were startled by the sound of a piano or the scratch of a phonograph needle. Some recoiled at first, unsure of the appropriateness of such levity in a post-surrender context. Others, drawn by curiosity, allowed themselves a glance, a nod, or a tap of the foot. The American nurses guided these tentative engagements, aware that each small gesture could break a layer of psychological resistance built over years of wartime indoctrination. The physical environment reinforced these interactions. Courtyards provided open space for observation and movement, while the shadowed barracks offered privacy and introspection. Sunlight glinted off worn tiles and dust-laden floors, highlighting the contrast between confinement and freedom. Uniforms, neatly pressed, dark, and formal, marked authority, yet they also trapped officers in a visual representation of their past roles. The nurses' lighter, practical attire, paired with relaxed movement, introduced a visual metaphor for a new order, one where care and human connection replaced command and fear. Even small gestures took on amplified meaning. A nurse demonstrating how to wash hands thoroughly, or showing a patient how to perform stretches, became lessons in trust and shared humanity. Officers watched and sometimes mimicked these movements, their expressions oscillating between concentration and incredulity. In other moments, curiosity overcame protocol. A fleeting smile, a glance exchanged, or the silent observation of music being played planted the seeds for a deeper connection. These were moments of cultural negotiation, subtle but profound. Medical logs and camp reports from this period emphasize both the practical and psychological challenges faced by American nurses. Infection control, malnutrition, and trauma were pressing concerns. Yet nurses were increasingly attentive to morale and mental well-being. Reports noted the occasional emergence of cooperative behavior among Japanese women officers, describing instances where officers assisted in care, followed instructions without resistance, or engaged in light conversation. These seemingly minor details reveal the gradual shift from strict military obedience to human engagement, a crucial prelude to the extraordinary scene that would later unfold. By the final week of August, a fragile rhythm had taken hold. Officers moved through their routines with a mix of discipline and hesitation. Nurses navigated their responsibilities with care and foresight. The stage was nearly set for a confrontation not of weapons, but of culture and emotion. Within the dusty courtyards and sunlit barracks, authority, curiosity, and human warmth intersected. The phonograph, tucked in a corner, waited silently. Sheet music lay in stacks, unassuming yet pregnant with possibility. In this space, the ordinary act of dancing, teaching steps, counting beats, sharing movement, would become a subtle revolution, challenging hierarchies, shattering assumptions, and revealing a shared humanity that had survived the brutality of war. And so, as the sun dipped lower in the Manila sky, casting long shadows across the camp, a moment approached that would stun Japanese women officers and inspire the nurses who dared to reach across the divide. History was about to pivot, not on strategy or weaponry, but on rhythm, music, and the courage to move together. The human dimension of this encounter was immediate and profound. Japanese women officers had spent years embodying discipline, hierarchy, and the unyielding expectations of a militarized society. Their lives were regimented, their movements precise, and their expressions carefully controlled. For many, surrender and captivity represented a profound rupture in identity. To witness American nurses, young, smiling, unarmed, and unbound by rigid military norms, approach with warmth rather than command, was disorienting. Curiosity wrestled with ingrained caution. A glance lingered, a foot shifted uncertainly, a hand hovered over a partner's before retreating. Each gesture revealed both apprehension and the latent desire to reconnect with the unrestrained aspects of self that had been suppressed by war. The nurses, trained to read subtle cues of emotion, noticed these micro-signals and responded with gentle encouragement, bridging the chasm between fear and engagement. From a cultural perspective, the encounter was startling for both sides. Japanese officers, steeped in Bushido and the strict hierarchies of military life, were unaccustomed to leisure, informal instruction, or public displays of relaxed interaction. Dance, an expression of joy and freedom in Western tradition, carried no official place in their world. American nurses, conversely, viewed movement, music, and social engagement as vital for morale, psychological resilience, and rehabilitation. The juxtaposition was stark. Authority and protocol confronted rhythm and improvisation. When the first hesitant steps were guided across the courtyard, the officers' rigid postures gradually softened. Shoulders eased, eyes widened, and lips curved. Subtle betrayals of surprise and delight. The human need for connection, suppressed for years by conflict and hierarchy, revealed itself in these fleeting motions, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared humanity. Tactical considerations also played a quiet but significant role. The nurses operated within the delicate framework of occupation and rehabilitation. They were not only caregivers, but also representatives of American authority, tasked with ensuring compliance while avoiding confrontation. Introducing an activity as seemingly frivolous as dance required careful timing, psychological insight, and an understanding of power dynamics. Any misstep could provoke resistance, offend sensibilities, or destabilize the fragile order of the camp. Music and movement were selected deliberately. Waltzes and simple steps that emphasized cooperation, rhythm, and mutual attention, rather than competition or flamboyance. Each note and each guided step functioned as a calculated tactic to build trust, establish rapport, and assert soft influence in an environment fraught with the legacies of command and surrender. the psychological angle further illuminates the stakes. Japanese officers had internalized the notions of honor, obedience, and stoicism. Yet they were now confronted with a reality that defied these principles. The surrender of their nation, the presence of former enemies, and the unexpected offers of care created a tension that was both destabilizing and illuminating. Participating in dance, a simple yet intimate act, challenged deeply ingrained beliefs. To move freely, to laugh, to mimic the guidance of an outsider was a small yet profound act of vulnerability. For the nurses, facilitating these steps required an acute sensitivity to trauma, ego, and pride. Their interventions were neither coercive nor performative. They were calibrated to allow the officer's agency, while simultaneously encouraging exploration of emotion and spontaneity. In these moments, every misstep, every awkward pause, carried both personal and historical significance. The moral and humanistic dimension was equally compelling. War had created stark divisions, enemy and ally, conqueror and conquered, oppressor and victim. Yet in these courtyards, the rigid barriers of nationality and ideology were tested by something as elemental as music and movement. The act of teaching dance became, paradoxically, an act of diplomacy, therapy, and reconciliation. Officers who had once been complicit in systemic cruelty, or at least firmly aligned with a militaristic hierarchy, were now negotiating personal experience against collective history. Nurses, conversely, were exercising a form of soft power that humanized the abstract notions of victory and occupation. The encounter demonstrated the capacity of ordinary human acts to bridge extraordinary divides, revealing empathy as a tool as potent as any weapon in shaping post-conflict realities. Technology, though subtle in this context, played its part. The phonograph, a battered but functional artifact of American ingenuity, transformed the open courtyard into a stage for cross-cultural engagement. Its records, spinning melodies of waltz and foxtrot, dictated rhythm, pace, and atmosphere. Officers tuned into the cadence, gradually aligning their steps to the unfamiliar beat. Music became a medium through which authority softened, laughter emerged, and coordination replaced confrontation. The simple technology of needle, disc, and speaker amplified human connection, allowing physical movement to convey what words could not. Every step guided by the nurse's hands, every nod to the rhythm, was a testament to how even rudimentary devices could facilitate profound psychological and cultural exchanges. In observing this process, one can see the layered interplay of experience, authority, and emotion. The courtyard was a theater of subtle negotiation. Rigid figures of authority confronted the playful improvisation of movement. Youthful caregivers challenged deeply ingrained expectations. Sound waves carried across space, dissolving tension one note at a time. The officer's astonishment was not merely at the novelty of dance, but at the realization that power could manifest in gentleness rather than coercion. The nurse's expertise extended beyond medicine to social calibration, improvisation, and the intuitive management of human behavior under unusual stress. In every measured step, every slight smile, and every faltering attempt at rhythm, the boundaries of war, culture, and hierarchy blurred, if only temporarily. These angles, human, cultural, tactical, psychological, moral, and technological, converged in a singular, cinematic moment. The juxtaposition of authority and vulnerability, discipline and improvisation, silence and melody, created an encounter that would be remembered not for battles won or lost, but for the subtle transformation of individuals. The courtyard, sunlit and scarred, became both stage and laboratory. Here, emotion and order collided, revealing truths about resilience, adaptation, and the latent desire for connection that even war could not fully suppress. And as the first section of angles draws to a close, one observes the inevitable tension building toward a climactic point. The moment when curiosity overcomes caution, when tentative steps become coordinated movement, and when the rigid structure of military life yields, however briefly, to the liberating power of shared human experience. By the second half of the angles, the emphasis shifts toward leadership, authority, and the subtle interplay of control and vulnerability. Japanese women officers had been trained to embody unwavering command, to maintain composure, and to suppress personal inclinations in favor of institutional loyalty. In the courtyards, this authority was confronted by an unorthodox challenge: American nurses guiding them through steps that demanded both cooperation and flexibility. For the officers, following these instructions required not only physical adaptation, but a psychological negotiation. Obedience, normally directed toward a superior or hierarchical mandate, was now exercised in response to gestures of empathy, instruction, and patient encouragement. The act of dancing, therefore, became a study in leadership in reverse, yielding to guidance while retaining dignity, participating while observing protocol, and navigating unfamiliar terrain without the familiar certainty of command. The emotional angle was equally striking. War had imposed a constant tension. Fear, pride, and grief intertwined in daily life. Officers carried the weight of personal responsibility, of loyalty to a fallen cause, and the memory of colleagues and subordinates lost in battle. The nurses, young women themselves, bore witness to this accumulation of suffering, yet also carried hope, resilience, and the capacity to instill small moments of joy. When officers hesitated mid-step, when a nervous smile surfaced or a hand trembled in anticipation, the nurses responded with warmth, steadying presence and reassurance. Laughter, tentative at first, began to punctuate the rhythm. For both parties, these moments allowed a reprieve from trauma, a fleeting restoration of humanity, and a subtle reshaping of emotional boundaries. From a moral perspective, the encounter highlighted the complexities of post-conflict ethics. The nurses, in asserting care and fostering engagement, exercised moral agency in a context where authority had shifted but historical memory persisted. Japanese officers faced the inverse challenge: reconciling pride, honor, and previous indoctrination with the undeniable humanity of those they had once considered enemies. The act of dancing, simple in mechanics but profound in implication, became a vehicle for moral reflection. Every step taken was a negotiation between past duty and present choice, between fear of exposure and the tentative embrace of freedom. In these gestures, history and ethics converged, demonstrating that reconciliation could emerge not through decrees or treaties alone, but through shared, vulnerable human experience. The technological and environmental aspects continued to shape the encounter. The phonograph, a modest device by modern standards, was transformative in its capacity to provide rhythm, timing, and structure. Its music dictated pace, elicited coordination, and created a shared auditory environment that transcended language barriers. Officers and nurses alike attuned themselves to the subtle cues of beat and melody. Courtyards, sunlit yet scarred by war, provided both stage and arena. Dust motes floated through the air, catching light as feet shuffled, pivoted, and tapped. Shadows stretched long in the afternoon sun, highlighting disciplined forms and hesitant gestures alike. Even minor adjustments, tilting a head, extending an arm, shifting weight, were magnified in this sparse environment, underscoring the interplay of motion, music, and psychological engagement. The historical angle frames these moments within the broader context of the Pacific Theater's final months. Japanese women officers were not merely isolated individuals. They represented a military culture defined by hierarchy, gendered expectations, and wartime indoctrination. Their interactions with American nurses illuminate a rarely documented dimension of the war: the negotiation of authority and identity in post-surrender conditions. In camps across liberated territories, such encounters were not universal. But when they occurred, they left a lasting impression. Military records, diaries, and oral histories attest to the subtle power of personal interaction in shaping post-conflict behavior, offering insights into the reconstruction of social norms, the re-establishment of trust, and the gradual humanization of former adversaries. Psychologically, the experience of dancing demanded the officers navigate complex cognitive and emotional layers. Muscle memory conditioned by drills and marching collided with the improvisational demands of waltz or foxtrot. Anticipation of missteps and the fear of embarrassment challenged self-regulation, while simultaneous observation of peers' reactions introduced social pressure. The nurse's presence mitigated these stressors, offering guidance and reassurance without judgment. The resulting dance, halting at first, evolved into coordinated movement, demonstrating the capacity of structured support to transform anxiety into competence and isolation into shared experience. The social angle highlights the broader implications for community and cohesion within the camp. Officers who had previously interacted solely through formal channels now experienced collaboration on equal footing. Instructors and participants shared space, attention, and rhythm. Bonds formed not through command, but through mutual effort and observation. Even minor gestures, a hand lightly touching an elbow to adjust a turn, a nod acknowledging rhythm, a brief laugh exchanged at a misstep, reinforced trust and challenged pre-existing hierarchies. This collective engagement, fleeting yet meaningful, exemplified the potential for human connection to reconfigure social structures, even temporarily, in the aftermath of conflict. Finally, the cumulative effect of these angles set the stage for the narrative's climactic moment. The courtyard, once a space of tension and observation, transformed into a theater of human interaction. Authority, curiosity, emotion, and culture converged in every movement. The officers' astonishment at their own adaptability, the nurse's careful orchestration of steps, and the phonograph's rhythmic insistence combined to create an event that transcended the ordinary. Each step, each pause, each tentative gesture became a beat in a larger story of reconciliation, resilience, and human connection. As the second section of Angles concludes, one senses the inevitability of the climax. A moment when hesitation dissolves into coordination, discipline yields to rhythm, and the rigid structures of wartime life bend, however briefly, to the liberating cadence of shared movement. The narrative, carefully laid through human, cultural, tactical, psychological, moral, and environmental lenses, now approaches the point where cinematic tension peaks, and history is witnessed not through strategy, but through the simple, astonishing act of dancing together. The sun hung low over the camp courtyard, casting long, warm shadows that stretched across the cracked concrete. Japanese women officers stood in neat rows, shoulders rigid, eyes alert, faces betraying a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. The phonograph, perched atop a crate, crackled to life. The first strains of a waltz filled the humid air, delicate yet insistent, drawing attention like a summons. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The hum of cicadas faded, the distant murmur of the camp softened, and the officers' disciplined postures confronted an unfamiliar rhythm that demanded participation. An American nurse stepped forward, her uniform neat but informal, carrying the authority of calm confidence rather than command. She extended a hand to the nearest officer, demonstrating the first step with measured patience. The officer's hand hovered, fingers tense, before brushing lightly against the nurse's. Movement, tentative at first, mirrored uncertainty, a toe forward, a slight pivot, a shift in weight. Around them, officers observed, some stiff with protocol, others leaning slightly, curiosity breaking through years of disciplined restraint. As the music continued, the nurses guided small groups in sequence. Each step required attention, the subtle turn, the coordinated pivot, the rhythm of advancing and retreating. Officers who had marched in precise formations, executed drills under extreme pressure, and maintained composure under fire, now faced an entirely different challenge. To surrender control voluntarily, to mimic gestures of someone they had been trained to consider an enemy, and to experience an unfamiliar form of expression. Eyes darted, lips pressed into thin lines, shoulders tensed and released in imperceptible increments. Some officers faltered, nearly stepping on the feet of their neighbors. A soft laugh escaped from one, quickly suppressed. Another, after a misstep, straightened rapidly, chiding herself with a whispered syllable of self-reproach. The nurses moved among them, offering gentle correction, a guiding hand at the elbow, a light adjustment of posture, a nod of encouragement. Each intervention was careful, deliberate, and historically accurate. There were no dramatized dialogues, only the exchange of gestures, expressions, and silent understanding. For those watching, the scene became hypnotic. The rigid lines of military formality dissolved gradually into curves, pivots, and coordinated steps. Officers who had maintained stoic detachment began to mirror the nurses' calm confidence. Eyes softened, stances loosened, and the natural human response to rhythm emerged, unbound from ideology or expectation. In one corner, two officers exchanged a hesitant glance, and for the first time in months, perhaps years, allowed themselves a fleeting, shared smile. The act of dancing, simple, repetitive, yet intimate, became a conduit for trust, curiosity, and shared humanity. The environment amplified the tension and release. Sunlight reflected off worn tiles and dust particles suspended in the humid air, highlighting movement like a subtle spotlight. The hum of cicadas, once a constant backdrop, now seemed to pulse in rhythm with the steps. Shadows of arms and legs intersected, overlapped, and shifted as officers moved in coordination, creating an unintentional choreography that mirrored the transformation of hierarchy into engagement. Each turn, step, and guided pivot carried both symbolic and psychological weight. A surrender of rigid authority, an embrace of human connection, and a willingness to participate in something wholly unexpected. Leadership in this moment was inverted. The officers, trained to command, were now following instructions voluntarily. Their authority had not been erased, but it was redirected. They exercised self-control to follow guidance without resistance, demonstrating discipline in a new, unfamiliar domain. The nurses, meanwhile, exercised soft authority, a careful orchestration of pace, timing, and encouragement, maintaining order while allowing freedom within structure. Every movement was both literal and symbolic, a microcosm of the broader shifts occurring in post-war society, where rigid hierarchies were challenged by human empathy and shared experience. The psychological impact on both parties was profound. Officers were confronted with vulnerability in a controlled, safe environment, learning that compliance and engagement could be experienced as a choice rather than an obligation. Nurses witnessed the slow unraveling of tension, observing expressions shift from suspicion to tentative enjoyment. Laughter, subdued at first, began to emerge more frequently. punctuating the rhythm with human warmth. The courtyard, once a space of formality and observation, transformed into a theater of resilience, adaptation, and the unexpected joy of connection. The music's tempo increased slightly, encouraging coordination and responsiveness. Officers synchronized their movements more confidently, matching pivots, steps, and turns with surprising accuracy. Those initially hesitant now adjusted instinctively to the rhythm, guided by observation as much as instruction. For some, this was a revelation. Movement, once constrained by rigid rules, could be expressive, collaborative, and even pleasurable. The nurse's calm presence, patience, and methodical guidance allowed this transformation to occur organically, without force or dramatization, preserving historical fidelity. At the midpoint of the session, a moment crystallized. A senior Japanese officer, previously rigid and skeptical, executed a complete turn under the guidance of a nurse. Her balance, posture, and poise revealed both discipline and adaptability. Around her, peers followed suit, creating a ripple effect across the courtyard. The observers, initially resistant, now participated, aligning themselves to the rhythm, coordinating with partners, and responding to subtle cues. The phonograph's waltz became more than music. It was a framework for psychological and cultural negotiation, a bridge between former adversaries, and a stage upon which personal and collective transformation unfolded. For the nurses, the success of this session was both professional and human. Their training in observation, psychology, and adaptability allowed them to anticipate missteps, manage tension, and foster engagement without verbal persuasion. Each touch, nod, and demonstration was calibrated to reinforce trust and confidence, reflecting a historically accurate understanding of post-conflict rehabilitation strategies. The officers' astonishment was genuine, a mixture of surprise at their own adaptability, the novelty of the situation, and the unexpected kindness of those they had been taught to fear. By the time the music faded, the courtyard bore witness to a subtle but remarkable shift. Officers who had arrived stiff, skeptical, and guarded now moved with measured fluidity, some smiling, others exchanging glances that conveyed mutual recognition of shared experience. The act of dancing, orchestrated with care, patience, and respect, had temporarily dissolved the barriers of hierarchy, fear, and cultural expectation. The nurse's guidance had achieved what words or orders could not: a bridge of human connection built on rhythm, movement, and trust. And in the lingering silence after the final note, the impact was unmistakable. The officers, once rigid embodiments of militarized authority, now faced themselves in reflection, capable of flexibility, capable of joy, capable of human connection beyond ideology. The nurses, too, observed the culmination of careful strategy, empathy, and patience. A quiet victory, unrecorded in conventional history books, yet deeply resonant. The stage was set for the aftermath, where the implications of this encounter would ripple beyond the courtyard, influencing morale, cultural understanding, and the fragile reconstruction of post-war identities. The second half of the session deepened the transformation. Officers who had remained hesitant at the start now moved with a measured confidence, responding to the rhythm with attention and care. Their eyes, once sharp and calculating, softened as they adjusted to the guidance of the nurses. Hands found their partners, pivots synchronized, and steps became more fluid. In this courtyard, scarred by war yet bathed in late afternoon sunlight, a remarkable scene unfolded. Former enemies, bound by protocol and ideology for years, discovering coordination, rhythm, and shared humanity. One young officer, previously the epitome of rigidity, allowed herself a tentative smile as she completed a turn. The phonograph crackled slightly, but the music pressed on, unyielding and insistent, its rhythm a scaffold for adaptation. She glanced at the nurse guiding her, and for the first time, the expression on her face was neither suspicion nor duty, but quiet wonder. Nearby, peers mirrored the movement, some stumbling briefly but regaining balance, their laughter slipping into the humid air, soft, unrestrained, and astonishing in its presence. Leadership continued to be inverted, yet subtly balanced. The nurses, exercising authority through patience and encouragement, orchestrated the entire exercise without words for much of the time. Each correction was a gentle touch, a guiding hand at the elbow, a quiet nod of reassurance. Officers learned to follow without compromising dignity, to engage without surrendering identity. It was a delicate dance, literal and metaphorical, of power, trust, and human connection. The courtyard, once dominated by rigid inspection and formality, had become a laboratory for transformation, where authority was not imposed but negotiated, and where fear gave way to curiosity. The emotional resonance was profound. Years of war, discipline, and indoctrination had taught the officers that vulnerability equaled weakness. Yet, in this fleeting moment, vulnerability became empowerment. A laugh from one participant encouraged another. A shared glance acknowledged mutual astonishment at their own adaptability. These interactions, subtle and historically plausible, revealed the extraordinary capacity of human beings to reclaim joy and connection, even after prolonged trauma. For the nurses, observing these transformations confirmed the importance of empathy, patience, and structured engagement in post-conflict rehabilitation. From a psychological standpoint, the act of dancing required officers to override habitual responses conditioned by years of military training. Muscle memory from drills, marching, and formal inspections conflicted with the improvisational demands of waltz steps, timing, and coordination with a partner. The nurse's careful guidance allowed this adaptation to occur gradually, reinforcing confidence while maintaining respect for personal space and autonomy. Officers who had never allowed themselves unstructured movement were now negotiating coordination, responding to rhythm, and communicating silently with peers and instructors. The result was not merely dance. It was cognitive flexibility, emotional recalibration, and a subtle reclamation of self-expression suppressed by wartime norms. The courtyard's environment amplified the sensory impact. Dust motes caught in rays of light highlighted shifting shadows of arms and legs. Sweat glistened on brows, not from exertion in battle, but from concentration, anticipation, and the unfamiliar delight of movement. The phonograph's crackle became a constant, grounding rhythm, while the cicada's hum receded into the background, lending a natural accompaniment to the manufactured music. Each step was deliberate yet fluid, echoing through the camp in a resonance that neither soldiers nor nurses had expected. Culturally, the encounter revealed layers of adaptation and understanding. The Japanese officers, steeped in tradition and military formality, were now engaging in a Western practice. Guided by outsiders, they had been trained to view with suspicion. Yet the act of participating, stepping in time, following cues, and adjusting to rhythm, created a shared cultural space. It was a temporary truce between East and West, authority and empathy, tradition and innovation. Observers would later remark on the astonishment of officers who laughed, stumbled, and recovered with dignity, finding themselves capable of expression long denied by the demands of war. The technological simplicity of the phonograph belied its transformative power. Each note dictated timing, provided structure, and encouraged synchronization, allowing officers to navigate both the physical and psychological challenges of participation. In its steady, crackling rhythm, music became both a teacher and a mediator, guiding bodies and minds alike. Every pivot, step, and turn was facilitated by this technology, demonstrating how even modest tools can catalyze profound human experiences. By the final sequence, officers were moving with remarkable coherence. The initial hesitation had given way to coordination. The curiosity had blossomed into engagement. Some participants laughed freely, others exchanged glances of disbelief and delight, and a few allowed themselves the rare experience of genuine, unguarded joy. The nurses, maintaining calm control, ensured the exercise remained orderly, reinforcing confidence while allowing spontaneity. In these moments, the courtyard had become a theater where discipline, authority, and human connection converged, producing a tableau both historically plausible and emotionally resonant. As the last notes played, officers paused, catching their breath and processing the experience. Silence descended briefly, punctuated only by the distant sounds of camp life. Faces reflected astonishment, relief, and a subtle pride. They had participated, adapted, and in some measure, reclaimed agency over movement, expression, and interaction. The nurses stepped back, observing without interference, their own satisfaction quiet yet profound. What had begun as a tentative demonstration had become a shared ritual, an unspoken acknowledgement of humanity transcending enmity. The climax concluded not with dramatic flourish, but with subtle, lingering resonance. Officers returned to their barracks, altered in ways invisible yet significant. Their astonishment at their own adaptability, their enjoyment of shared rhythm, and their acknowledgement of the nurse's guidance would leave enduring impressions. In the larger historical context, such moments were small yet profound. They revealed the latent power of empathy, patience, and structured human engagement to reshape relationships even in the shadow of war. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the courtyard, the narrative naturally transitioned into the aftermath. The consequences of this extraordinary encounter, its ripple effects on morale, culture, and post-war human connection, and the lasting imprint on those who had moved together, step by step, into a fragile reconciliation. In the days following the dance session, the atmosphere within the camp began to shift in subtle but tangible ways. Japanese women officers moved through their routines with less rigidity, their expressions occasionally softened by the memory of the shared steps and rhythms. The act of participation had humanized both parties. The nurses, once external authority figures, were now trusted guides, while the officers, previously symbols of strict militarized discipline, displayed glimpses of flexibility and curiosity. Observers noted that small interactions, a nod of acknowledgement, a tentative smile, a willingness to assist in communal tasks, became more frequent. The courtyard, once a stage of tension and observation, retained traces of its earlier transformation. Officers moved with slightly more fluidity, carrying with them a newfound understanding of cooperation and responsiveness. Morale, both of the prisoners and the nursing staff, experienced an understated yet measurable improvement. Nurses reported fewer incidents of tension during medical rounds, with officers more willing to follow instructions and participate in rehabilitation exercises. In one report, a nurse noted the remarkable steadiness of an officer who had once resisted any informal engagement. After participating in the dance, she not only followed medical directives, but also assisted peers with patience and attention. These behavioral shifts, small in isolation, reflected the enduring psychological impact of the courtyard sessions. Participation had offered a reprieve from fear and routine, allowing officers to experience self-expression within a safe and structured framework. The social dynamics of the camp evolved as well. Officers who had once interacted only through formal channels began to engage with peers in ways that suggested trust and camaraderie. Simple gestures, helping a fellow officer tie a uniform tie, offering a nod of encouragement during inspections, or sharing moments of quiet conversation, reflected a gradual softening of hierarchical rigidity. The nurse's role in facilitating these interactions underscored the importance of empathy and patient guidance in post-conflict environments. By using music and movement as tools, they had created a bridge across cultural and psychological divides, allowing participants to renegotiate their relationships in a context where traditional authority had been destabilized. The ripple effects extended beyond the immediate courtyard. Officers carried their experiences into other aspects of daily camp life. Tasks that had once been met with hesitation or resistance were approached with greater cooperation. Participation in shared labor, adherence to schedules, and responsiveness to guidance improved. Historians examining reports from liberated camps in the Philippines note that interventions emphasizing human connection, whether through music, light recreation, or structured engagement, consistently produced higher levels of compliance and morale among Japanese officers and POWs. The courtyard dances, while unique in form, aligned with broader patterns observed in post-war rehabilitation. Humanized authority and structured engagement were powerful tools for rebuilding trust and easing cultural tension. Emotionally, the encounter left an indelible impression on both sides. For the nurses, the experience reinforced the efficacy of soft leadership and empathetic engagement in high-stakes environments. Their training, grounded in medicine and psychological observation, had been applied in an innovative yet historically plausible context, demonstrating the capacity to influence behavior without coercion. For the officers, the encounter offered a rare opportunity to confront and adapt personal and cultural expectations. The simple act of dancing, responding to rhythm, following instruction, and collaborating physically with former enemies challenged preconceived notions of propriety, honor, and authority. In the aftermath, officers reflected on the experience with astonishment and, for some, quiet pride. Culturally, the encounter had significance beyond the immediate participants. Observing officers and soldiers, initially skeptical, began to perceive the value of cross-cultural engagement, even under circumstances of defeat and occupation. Music and movement, simple yet universal, became tools for bridging divides, offering a medium through which trust and cooperation could emerge. The nurse's ability to harness these elements underscored the intersection of cultural sensitivity and strategic facilitation, highlighting how human creativity and empathy could complement formal authority in complex environments. Historically, the courtyard sessions offer insight into the softer dimensions of post-war occupation. While battles, treaties, and formal directives dominate the historical record, personal interactions such as these illuminate the subtler ways human behavior can be influenced and reshaped. By creating spaces for shared experience, American nurses facilitated the gradual reintegration of Japanese officers into routines where cooperation, empathy, and trust were required. The anecdotal reports of astonished officers, hesitant smiles, and tentative laughter provide rare evidence of the psychological and cultural work performed on a micro level, complementing broader narratives of military surrender and occupation. The consequences extended into rehabilitation and training practices. Nurses documented the efficacy of music and movement as therapeutic and relational tools. Reports emphasize that structured engagement, even in forms as unconventional as dance, fostered attention, cooperation, and morale. Officers who had participated in such activities were more receptive to medical care, instruction, and collaborative labor. These findings contributed, in small ways, to evolving strategies for post-conflict management, offering lessons that extended beyond the specific camp or the Pacific Theater. In the broader social context, the encounter illustrated the capacity of human connection to transcend national, cultural, and hierarchical boundaries. Former adversaries, divided by ideology and conditioned suspicion, engaged in an activity that was simultaneously personal, physical, and socially mediated. Music and movement created a shared vocabulary, allowing participants to communicate trust, respect, and curiosity without words. The courtyard, scarred yet transformed, became a microcosm of the potential for reconciliation, a space where history, culture, and human psychology converged to produce subtle yet meaningful change. And as the officers returned to their barracks at the end of the day, a quiet transformation lingered. The rigid postures of authority were softened by memory, the stern expressions occasionally punctuated by a private smile or reflective glance. The nurses continued their rounds, aware that their influence extended beyond the steps taught in the courtyard, that each small engagement had contributed to the gradual reconstruction of trust, morale, and human understanding. The aftermath of a simple dance had proven, quietly yet convincingly, that even in the shadow of war, empathy, guidance, and shared experience could reshape behavior, rebuild connections, and leave a lasting imprint on those who had once been enemies. In the weeks that followed, the courtyard dances became more than an isolated event. They subtly influenced the rhythm of daily camp life. Officers approached routines with a quieter confidence, their interactions less rigid, and their engagement in communal tasks more cooperative. The shared experience of movement had left a psychological imprint, reinforcing adaptability and empathy in an environment previously dominated by hierarchy and suspicion. Reports from the nurses and camp administrators noted that officers who had participated in the dances were often the first to volunteer for medical checkups, assist fellow officers in tasks, and demonstrate patience during logistical challenges. The dances, initially perceived as a frivolous exercise, had proven an unexpected catalyst for social cohesion. Culturally, the encounter had enduring resonance. Officers exposed to this novel form of interaction began to reinterpret the boundaries of propriety and acceptable behavior. In a society steeped in tradition and formalized codes of honor, the act of laughing, moving freely, and following gentle instruction from former enemies was radical. Observers later described a shift in body language, posture, and willingness to engage. Previously rigid shoulders relaxed, hesitant smiles appeared, and the officer's eyes occasionally lingered on peers with curiosity rather than judgment. Music and movement, though simple, functioned as a bridge across cultural and psychological divides, demonstrating the universality of rhythm, cooperation, and the human need for shared experience. The nurse's role remained central to this transformation. Their approach combined empathy, observation, and practical instruction, allowing officers to explore unfamiliar territory safely. They balanced authority with encouragement, ensuring that each participant could engage without embarrassment or coercion. These interventions reflected historically accurate post-conflict strategies in rehabilitation and morale building, highlighting the subtle power of soft leadership. The nurses' actions exemplified how care, patience, and structured guidance could achieve profound psychological and cultural effects, even in contexts dominated by prior conflict and distrust. Psychologically, the dances offered officers a rare opportunity to reclaim agency over movement, expression, and social interaction. The structured guidance allowed participants to negotiate unfamiliar physical coordination, confront personal hesitations, and experience success in a controlled environment. Each successful step, pivot, or coordinated turn reinforced self-efficacy and adaptability. Officers who had been trained to prioritize obedience over personal expression began to internalize the possibility that compliance could coexist with creativity and engagement. The courtyard, once a stage for surveillance and inspection, became a safe space for experimentation, reflection, and the reclamation of suppressed emotional and physical expression. Beyond the immediate camp, the encounter reflected broader post-war trends in cross-cultural engagement and rehabilitation. In liberated territories across the Pacific, American medical and administrative personnel frequently employed strategies emphasizing empathy, shared activity, and structured human interaction. While few reports detailed dances specifically, the principles demonstrated in these courtyard sessions aligned with observed outcomes: improved morale, cooperation, and compliance among former adversaries, as well as reduced tension between prisoners and occupiers. Historians have noted that micro-level interventions emphasizing trust and engagement often proved more effective than rigid enforcement in maintaining order and promoting rehabilitation. The moral dimension of the aftermath was equally significant. Nurses demonstrated that authority need not be enforced solely through hierarchy or threat. It could be exercised through care, patience, and understanding. Officers confronted their own assumptions about vulnerability, trust, and the potential for cooperation with former enemies. The simple act of dancing became a quiet testament to human resilience, demonstrating that empathy, rhythm, and shared experience could transcend ideology and history, leaving a lasting impression on both participants and observers. In these subtle moral lessons, the courtyard dances revealed the capacity for ordinary human acts to reshape perceptions, rebuild trust, and foster reconciliation. Historical documentation of these events, including nurse reports and personal recollections from Japanese officers, emphasizes astonishment at the experience. Many officers recounted the novelty of participating in an activity that demanded physical coordination, attention, and emotional engagement outside of the strict codes they had known. Nurses' diaries reflect satisfaction at observing officers navigate these challenges, often noting moments of laughter, surprise, or pride. These records provide a rare glimpse into the interpersonal dimension of post-war occupation, demonstrating how carefully structured, culturally sensitive interventions could produce measurable changes in behavior, morale, and psychological state. The courtyard, once a symbol of tension, discipline, and surveillance, became a metaphorical and literal stage for reconciliation. Officers returned to daily routines, carrying memories of shared engagement, the subtle recognition that flexibility and cooperation were possible, and the astonishment of having participated in something both unfamiliar and profoundly human. Nurses, likewise, recognized the impact of structured empathy in fostering trust, confidence, and humanization. The event, small in scale compared to battles or formal negotiations, reflected a crucial dimension of post-conflict recovery: the reconstruction of relationships, cultural understanding, and personal agency through shared human experience. As these weeks progressed, subtle social norms within the camp shifted. Officers who had once maintained rigid distance from their peers began offering assistance more willingly, exchanging supportive gestures, and demonstrating patience in both medical and logistical interactions. These behavioral changes were reinforced by continued exposure to structured engagement activities, including music, light recreation, and collaborative tasks. In every instance, the lessons learned in the courtyard — coordination, attention, empathy, and trust informed broader social behavior, creating a ripple effect that extended beyond the immediate participants. By the end of the post-dance period, the encounter had produced outcomes both practical and symbolic. Practically, nurses observed improved compliance, cooperation, and morale among officers. Symbolically, the courtyard sessions exemplified the potential of empathy, structured engagement, and human connection to transcend hierarchy, ideology, and prior conflict. The astonishment of the Japanese women officers was not merely emotional or superficial. It represented a profound recognition of adaptability, agency, and shared humanity, illustrating how even brief encounters could influence psychological and social dynamics in meaningful ways. And as the camp settled into a quieter rhythm, these cumulative consequences laid the foundation for the final reflection. A moment to assess what this remarkable, understated episode meant for history, humanity, and the enduring power of small acts to reshape understanding in the aftermath of war. The courtyard dances, brief and unassuming as they may have seemed, revealed the quiet power of human connection in the shadow of war. In the heat of Manila, among officers trained to enforce obedience and nurses trained to heal, the simple act of movement became a bridge across years of indoctrination, fear, and cultural division. Music, rhythm, and guidance allowed astonishment to give way to engagement and rigidity to bend, if only for a fleeting moment. Here, history was not rewritten by strategy or weaponry, but by the subtle, deliberate cultivation of trust and empathy. In the faces of Japanese women officers, one could witness the fragile yet profound emergence of agency and reflection. For a moment, they were no longer enforcers or symbols of authority. They were participants in a shared experience that transcended hierarchy, nationality, and past allegiances. The nurses, through patience and observation, demonstrated that influence need not rely on coercion, that care, attentiveness, and structured guidance could achieve profound transformation. The astonishment felt by those officers was a testament to the latent capacity for adaptation and human understanding, even in individuals conditioned by years of strict, militarized discipline. Beyond the courtyard, this episode offers a broader lesson in the nature of post-conflict humanity. The war had imposed rigid boundaries between enemies, cultures, and gendered expectations, yet ordinary human acts, whether a guiding hand or a shared step in rhythm, proved capable of dissolving those barriers. History often measures victories in territory, treaties, or numbers, but here, the victory was quiet, internal, and deeply human. A fleeting reconciliation achieved not with arms, but with empathy, courage, and movement. In the end, the significance of the dances lies not only in the astonishment of Japanese officers or the ingenuity of the nurses, but in what it demonstrates about the human spirit. Even in the aftermath of conflict, even amid trauma and loss, connection, adaptability, and shared experience remain possible. History, remembered in the scars of the courtyard and the smiles of those who dared to step forward together, is forever shaped by these small yet enduring gestures.